the pro-Europeanism you see now is not a defense of the idea of Europe. It's a defense of the idea of taking the 200 billion euros that have been budgeted as part of the post-COVID recovery fund and spending them wisely on infrastructure and trusting Draghi to do that more than the horse traders who appear to be in charge in Italy now.
Welcome back to another episode of In Common Decency.
Luigi Barzini, the Italian social critic, wrote in his 1964 American bestseller about his home country that the Italian way of life cannot be considered a success except by temporary visitors. It solves no problems. It makes them worse. Chris Caldwell has been more than a temporary visitor over the years, so his noted essay on First Things magazine in the early days of COVID-19, titled Italy in Crisis, seemed to concur with Barzini in several ways.
Now, to be fair, he may have had a few biases. Chris's 2009 bestseller, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam and the West, is the kind of thorough portrait of modern Europe that we seek to emulate at In Common Decency. A work of thorough Euro-realism.
Alessandra Bocchi of the Wall Street Journal, for her part, has in many ways traveled inversely to Chris's worldly tours of Barzini-like social criticism. She's also a regular at First Things and several other illustrious reviews, and upon living and studying in Italy and the UK, she currently helps edit the journal's op-ed pages as Joe Rago Memorial Fellow from New York.
We are so blessed to have these two distinguished writers discuss the Italian malaise on our show, in the wake of Mario Draghi's formation of a new Italian government.
Is the Italian political imagination as fractious as we tend to think? Was Matteo Salvini's clarion call to close Europe's borders a harbinger of a new sort of immigration politics across Europe? If so, what are other canaries in the Italian coal mine that may augur tide changes across the old world?
Remember to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps us tremendously to reach a wider audience and keep this show growing.
Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Decency. We are so blessed today to welcome two distinguished journalists, writers that not just on a professional level, but also on a sort of personal level, we both very much look up to, and we're incredibly grateful that they are making time for us at a very early time in the morning. They're both based on the East Coast of the United States, whereas we are in the old world. So they've had to, they're availing themselves at a very early time for them. So we're very grateful. And we're here to discuss Italy, which is a country and a topic that is very close to the hearts of both of them. I will begin introducing them briefly. Alessandra Bocchi is the Joe Rago Memorial Fellow of the Wall Street Journal's opinion page. Her writings have featured in a number of publications through the years. She's worked as a journalist for a long time, really. She's written for First Thing, she's written for The Spectator, National Review, The American Conservative, and a range of others. She's also extensively reported on a number of countries in Asia, North Africa, and obviously her own country, home country of Italy. And a recent piece that we'd love to plug by Alessandra featured in the Journal last week. And if I'm summing up your argument, Alessandra, correctly, you seem to argue that some of the recent insurrections that we've seen in the United States in the form of BLM riots and Capitol storming mobs, those things really have nothing on the Gatte Rosse, right, and the years of Lee.
Yes, absolutely. It was just a way to show that insurrection really has a different face, and even the term domestic terrorism, which has been thrown around from various people, whether politicians or in the media, actually has a different meaning from what happens recently with the storming of Capitol Hill or the summer riots. As disturbing as those acts were, they were not organized as part of an effort to overthrow the government or to affect any real change. And we're seeing that now, like nothing has really changed.
Sure, sure. And we really encourage folks to head over to the journal and read your piece. And on the other side of the line, we have Chris Caldwell, who is a senior editor of the Claremont Review of Books. He's, suffice it to say, widely renowned on both sides of the Atlantic as a most perceptive observer and a commentator on European matters. He's perhaps best known, or at least in Europe, best known for his 2009 book, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam, and the West. Although his most recent work, which is equally self-recommending, is The Age of Entitlement, America since the 60s, which came out last year. And besides covering the country for a range of publications as well through the years, Chris actually visited Italy in the early days of the pandemic, and he published a really fascinating essay that we also encourage folks to read on First Things, called Italy in Crisis. So folks, I just want to give a brief introduction and very quickly head over to Alessandra first and then to Chris for your sort of generic assessment of where we are at the moment in Italian politics and Italian society and generally Italian life. We'll start with some context just to hew close to the news cycle. Italy is, in the grip of what seems like a secular form of political stalemate, right? There's a data point that is routinely given in some of the mainstream media that says, since the end of World War II, Italy has had 66 governments at an average rate of almost one every year, right? Alessandro will maybe fact check me on this. But perhaps because of the Italian establishment's inability to anchor its policies, its programs, and wide popular support, and also because it is sought to alleviate that failure with technocracy at some points, the country's also been a playground of populism of various sorts, right? There was an odd assortment of right and left-wing populism that filled that vacuum, right, in the form of a coalition government of the Lega Nord and the Cinque Stelle movement. But then the Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini pulled out of that governing coalition in September 2019. And we moved into what was then called the Conte II government, the Giuseppe Conte II government of Partito Democratico, the sort of center-left, and the Cinque Stelle movement. So the latest item in the news cycle that I want to hew to is that Matteo Renzi now has pulled out of the Conte II government. And that triggered the prime minister's resignation. And there's an ongoing round of contacts at the moment. And some of the latest reporting suggests that former ECB President Mario Draghi has been called on to facilitate these contacts. So Alessandra first and then Chris. How do you even begin to diagnose, Alessandra, the fractiousness of Italy, the never-ending quest to find a stable government? The old sort of political families seem to be at all-time lows of support. Their insurgent rivals seem equally unable to agree on a governing agenda. What's, in your view, the rock-bottom source of the political disillusion in Italian public opinion?
Well, Italy is very fractured, but it's also very united in a way because it has a different political system in the sense that it's not a bipolar system like the one that you have in the United States or even the United Kingdom, where you really have two alternatives and two parties. In Italy, you have many different parties, and what you see is that they all have different agendas, so it can create some confusion. But ultimately, they're also willing to form alliances with each other, even when their agendas completely contradict one another. So, for example, you had, the League form a coalition with the Five Star Movement first, and then the Five Star Movement, very surprisingly, formed a coalition with the Partito Democratico, which it was founded on opposing that establishment party. So it was really quite ironic. And now we're seeing possibly the League form a coalition with the Partito Democratico. So Italy seems very confusing and it seems very fractured, but in reality, the parties are always willing to put their differences aside. If you want to have a cynical perspective, perhaps to maintain or achieve power. But otherwise, it's also because they're willing to compromise.
It's very interesting. Chris?
Yeah, I quite agree with that. That's the Italian government has been, in general, a very well-run government. It's a much better run government than people give it credit for. They have some very serious problems. Among the most serious is their debt, which is at about 2.5 trillion euros, which is about the same size per capita as ours. But Italy does not control its own currency. It's got a shrinking population, and it's got some really big problems. However, if you look at Italy's, conduct of its government over the last 20 years under a whole bunch of very different kind of parties, including, the television mogul Silvio Berlusconi, and parties of the left, including the mixed populist government that's come up. Italy has balanced its budget in the last 20 years. So it is actually it's a pretty well-run country.
Well, that's really interesting, and a really succinct and handy way to get into the heart of the matter. And it really helps to kind of, as Alessandra was alluding, there's what we get from the mainstream media as non-Italians in other parts of the world, and then there's setting that in the context of how the political system works, and as Chris alluded as well, in some of the larger challenges that get less coverage. But I want to, for my next question, I want to quote from Chris's essay in First Things. There's a part of it that I found fascinating where, at the beginning of the essay, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but precisely, yes, the COVID pandemic seemed to deepen some of the political fractures, and we'll get into that in a second. But you were, you were also reporting at the beginning of your essay how, you saw Italians coming around a sense of nationhood culture, right? That had been, fueled by the sense of crisis and the pandemic. And what you write in the essay, at one point reads, adjusting one's philosophy to new realities is a slow process. Italians have been adapting heroically, patriotically, and in fact, as quickly as one could hope. Their world, despite appearances, will eventually come back together. But perhaps when it does, it will be in a more durable and sensible way, one that puts Italians in less danger of being ruled by people who don't know their swear words and don't weep when they hear Nessun Dorma. And that's something, it seems like that's, it's a song that Italians were singing coming out of their balcony. So perhaps starting with Chris and then going to Alessandra, what is the growing sense of nationhood that you were witness to when you were in Italy, and how does that shape politics in major ways that we should be aware?
Yeah, I don't know how specific it is to Italy. It's taking an Italian form because it's happening in Italy. The COVID crisis is something that everyone, rich or poor, in every part of the countries that are affected by it, has been affected by. And it's really, it has brought countries together. Yesterday in the United States was Super Bowl Sunday. And if you watched the advertisements, all of the companies were making appeals to the viewers in terms of we this and we that. So I think that there is this sense of a national ordeal, which will strengthen national feeling. I think to some extent in Italy, it has reinforced the idea among Italians that Italy is poorly run. I don't know, as I say, I think that this is exaggerated. I think Italy is a better run country than even its natives believe. But there's a very specific element in Europe that we don't have in the United States. And that is the very poor performance of the European Union in both in developing vaccines against the virus and in rolling them out. It's basically the European Union. I get the impression that a lot of people have the feeling that the crisis is going to be resolved from elsewhere. And I think that there was a tension in Italian society to begin with, at the beginning of the coronavirus problem, that came from Italians' waning faith in the European Union. And I think that's got worse. But I think there's another tension that's got worse, and that is in all of these countries, I think coronavirus has tended to strengthen the already rich, to strengthen the already connected, to strengthen the people who are, concentrated in the boom cities of the global economy at the expense of small business people. And that hurts Italy, not just because Italy has a lot of small business people, which it does, but also because they're now trying to launch a technocratic government, and there might be a larger well of, let's say, distrust for such a government than you would expect. Then, for example, you would have seen the last time Italy had such a government, which was 10 years ago when they brought in Mario Monti to manage the Euro crisis.
And Alessandra, I'm sure you have a wealth of thoughts on everything Chris has just said, but also some real life experiences growing up in Italy. What's your sense of the sense the sense of how COVID has affected the social fabric in Italy?
Well, I perfectly agree that Italians believe that they have a very poorly run government, and they always complain about how bad their government is. And I definitely had that sentiment and experience. And there is truth to that in the sense that it is very bureaucratic, despite being very productive. It has very high debt levels. It's not able to manage the diversity in its regions in the country, really. You have a very industrialized and productive north. You have southern Italy that is very much lagging behind and has no industries. It used to have agriculture. That's not the case anymore. And so you have a country that is not, perhaps it's run better than Italians think, but there is some truth to the fact that Italians feel disaffected. And that was part of the reason for the rise in populism in the first place. The 5-Star Movement promised to put an end to the corruption that is so endemic in the country, and I would say even in the culture itself. And the League promised to end mass immigration, but also many people forget that the League was born as a party that wanted autonomy for the North, if not separatism brought to an extreme. So it also believed in deregulation in the sense of giving more power to individual regions. So you have these populist forces coming up, and the system tried to defeat them through these technocratic governments. But what we're seeing now, I think, is very interesting, because Mario Draghi he's definitely a technocrat, but he's not the stereotypical one. He's has a wide range of experiences. He was president of the European Central Bank, and he was responsible. He's given credit for taking Europe out of the Eurozone crisis in 2012, and also for issuing quantitative easing that really also helped the Eurozone. And he was seen with skepticism from Germany and Northern European countries because he was Italian, and they didn't want to bail out the lazy Southern Europeans. But he was able to really compromise all these different forces, and he's been very successful in weathering a very big crisis, the Eurozone crisis. So he's not your typical technocrat that comes out of university. He is also an academic in the sense that he has close relationships with the United States, which is also interesting. He earned his PhD in economics at MIT. He was fellow at Harvard. He worked for Goldman Sachs. He was governor of the Bank of Italy and headed the Treasury. So he has a really wide range of experience. He's not your typical technocrat. And you have various populist forces now in Italy supporting him and wanting to form a government with him, and in a way competing to do so. So that's also a very interesting development. And we could see with Mario Draghi a compromise between populism and the EU establishment.
I thought what Alessandra said was just fascinating. I think when you compare that, just before Francois launches into a different topic with his next question, I think that's going to be really useful for the audience, right? Is that in a lot of other European countries, you just simply couldn't conceive of a populist party coming around heeding the call of someone of Mario Draghi's profile to form a government. I mean, the fact that these populists in Italy aren't seeing Draghi as necessarily anathema in every kind of way just tells you a lot about what kind of populism it is. And I think it's a different kind of populism to the one that you see in other parts of Europe. So I appreciate you walking us through all of that, Alessandra. That was very helpful.
Jorge, I think it's a very specific thing that's going on here. You had a great uprising of populism of these two different kinds in 2018. As Alessandra correctly says, you had the basic thrust of the League was anti-immigration. The basic thrust of the the basic thrust of the Five Star Movement, since it arose in 2013, was anti-corruption. But there were a lot of elements to that anti-corruption. And, they talked about doing things like making political decisions with, computer algorithms. They had, they had a lot of mass gatherings online. They had a sort of like a futuristic idea of politics that didn't really work out, I would say, in power. And when they were in power in 2018 and 2019, a lot of the populist energy that was in the Five Star Movement began gravitating to the League. And so the Five Star Movement was kind of a shell of a party. It controlled a lot of seats in the parliament, but it wasn't really moving people on a popular level. And that's the position that they're in now. They have these seats in parliament who are needed to validate a technocratic government, but they don't really have a clear path ahead. And if there were elections, which is the only alternative to this technocratic government, they would quite possibly get wiped out. So they really are not. I don't think that their backing of Draghi. It's a matter of it's just like the formation of the second Conte government. It doesn't really reflect an endorsement of the program. It reflects they're just buying time and hoping to come up with a new way to survive. I don't know if Alessandra would agree with that verdict.
Yes, absolutely. That's the case for the Five Star Movement. It has lost much of its appeal because, well, people don't really know what it stands for. At the beginning, it was a loose cannon, so it could have become anything. But now it's become nothing at all. So why would people vote for the Five Star Movement if they can see some of those? It's also a very divided party. If they see some of those views better reflected in the center-left PD party, Partito Democratico, or the League, I mean, absolutely. And also those who did oppose the establishment and wanted things to change will probably gravitate towards the League. But also, and yes, the Five Star Movement is supporting this Draghi government, and it supported Conte too, because it knew that it had lost much of its appeal, and that if there were going to be elections, it would probably lose or come in third at least. But also you have Salvini supporting a Draghi government and wanting to form a coalition possibly with the center-left PD party. So like I said, it's very confusing. You have parties who hated each other, who were some parties that were born to oppose the other one, somehow managing to form a coalition and become allies. And that's what's happening now.
This will sound very strange to our American viewers who already struggle with the concept of bipartisanship. It seems like Italy has invented multipartisanship.
Exactly. And it makes it more interesting in some ways, but it's easy for parties to compromise their core values. But with the League, I think, Salvini wants to support Draghi. The only party that is not supporting Draghi, really the mainstream party, is Giorgia Meloni. Giorgia Meloni's party that's called Fratelli d'Italia, which means Brothers of Italy. It's a very right-wing party, and she's also gained a lot of support in the polls. She's polling, I believe, at 10 or 12% now. And she opposes this government, and she said she won't support a Draghi government. But Salvini is, which is surprising. The reason is that he needs credibility from Brussels and the EU establishment in some way, because he realized he can't just be, I think, a populist and post on social media all day. He needs some kind of credibility. And also because early elections at this time are very risky. Not only is Italy in the middle of a pandemic, but also it's going to manage this huge economic investment from the European Union to save its economy. So what the political class is saying now that doesn't want elections, and what the president of the Republic, Sergio Mattarella, said, is that we cannot afford an election at this time. There's too much at stake. And Mario Draghi is kind of the most authoritative Italian figure to possibly weather this storm. So that's the rationale behind it. And Salvini himself said, we agree and we're willing to put our differences aside to work in the best interest of the country.
So I just want to bounce back on what Christopher and Alessandro have said. You touched on the issue of Europe, which I thought was interesting, because Chris talked about the kind of deepening of the anti-EU sentiment. We all remember the kind of very strong, powerful images of European flags being burnt on TikTok videos and whatnot. And there's kind of a general souring on even, identified pro-European politicians. The anger has somewhat calmed down since last March. And there's no serious talk of Italy with Lego or whatnot. But there's one thing I want to walk through is how did Italy go from being one of the founding fathers of the EU, the country of Alcide de Gasperi, the country of even more recently Romano Prodi? How did we end up having the Italy being a stalwart defender of the EU to the situation we have nowadays? And also, let's talk a little bit about a paradox, which I thought was interesting, is at the moment where we have a kind of a general souring on EU sentiment in Italy, it seems that mainstream parties are becoming much more moderate, especially Lega, on the EU. How do you explain this kind of growth anti-EU sentiment, and also how do you explain at the same time this paradox of parties becoming much more moderate on the EU?
Well, that's a lot. I would say, why was Italy so pro-European? Well, Italy has, we have to go back to the Cold War. I would not call Italy an anti-American country. There are too many bonds of particularly through migration, and I think that Italy is generally a pro-American country. But Italy had a kind of a unique experience of the Cold War, and this goes back to the years of fascism in ways that were kind of like far from our subject. But basically, Italy came out of World War II with a communist party that was about a third of its electorate. And the goal, both of the rest of Italian political life and of the United States, was to keep the Communist Party out of power. Mm-hmm. And that required a lot of real pressure on the Italian political system. Including a lot of corruption. And pretty much the moment the Cold War ended, the Italian political system blew up. It's a sign that it didn't have a lot of popular legitimacy behind it. I think that Italians at that point, let's say the early to mid 90s, were probably quite eager for the idea of a European pole, the idea of sort of like reintegrating themselves into Europe rather than the American empire. Mm-hmm. As for why that has changed, I would say, first of all, I think everywhere you see anti-European sentiment in Europe. Immigration is the main problem. Immigration, Italy was very late to get immigration. It's pretty much a 21st century thing. But in the last 5 or 10 years, it has really begun to pick up speed. It has really begun to increase parabolically. Now, when the United States was going through its biggest, most recent wave of immigration, its economy was booming. That's not the case in Italy. And because of the debt, because of the competition with China, you have a lot of deindustrialization in Italy. And I think that people are beginning to feel that there is something that there's some close link between the European Union and specifically the euro and their collapsing economy, because Italian growth ended just about 2000. I just want to remind you, okay, that in 1990, when the Cold War ended, Italy had the 5th largest economy in the world behind the United States, the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan. Its economy has stagnated and even shrunk since 2000, which is the same year that Italy and everyone else entered the euro. So I think that's a big part of the problem.
And Alessandra, maybe?
Oh, you're muted, Alessandra?
Yes, sorry. Absolutely, immigration has been a driving force in having these populist party rise to power, and also behind Euroskepticism, because the EU was very much in favor of immigration. And Italians are new to immigration as well. It's not a country, made up of immigrants or that has any experience with immigration. Also doesn't have the same colonial history that, say, France and the United Kingdom have. So it really didn't have large waves of immigrants coming from former colonies. And so it has had a difficult time integrating many of these immigrants. And especially, I would say, those coming from the civil war in Libya, which were not Libyans, but from sub-Saharan Africa, who used Libya as a route to enter Europe. And Italy was basically became the ports of Europe. And even the 5-Star Movement said this. Now, the dynamics have somewhat changed because immigration is no longer the top priority just because of coronavirus kind of stopping the general flow of people around the world, although it is still happening to some degree, but not as much as before. What is interesting is that now that we're having consultations going on between the various parties and a possible Draghi government, is that the PD, Partito Democratico, which is center-left, very pro-immigration and very pro-EU, fears that Draghi is actually agrees more with Salvini on the issue of immigration, which is a very interesting development. And we don't really know what Draghi thinks. He's not a public figure. He doesn't have a public profile. He doesn't really like to speak to the press. So, but we know that he agreed with many of Salvini's policies, even in terms of economics. I mean, people forget that the League is very much a strange party in terms of allocating it on their left or their right, even on economic issues, because it was born as a party that opposed the centralization of power in Rome, especially in terms of economics, because you had these very productive industrialized regions in the north having to sacrifice, what they earned to help southern Italy, which was really lagging behind. It has much higher unemployment. It doesn't really have any industries, and that money was really being wasted by the central government in Rome. So, like I briefly mentioned earlier, the League is for more power to individual regions and to some extent privatization as well from the central government, which doesn't mean privatizing healthcare at all. Like, those are non-negotiable in Italy, like healthcare and education. But there are some themes that they would agree with. So we're seeing a very interesting almost synthesis of these various different forces, and it could be very successful in a way.
Yeah, I tend to think that Draghi is really in the driver's seat here, and that it would be, should he decide to support the government, Salvini conforming to Draghi's views, and rather than the other way around. I think that Alessandra has this right. The League is a party that was founded in the late 1980s. It can be understood as being part of the sort of the Reaganite or Thatcherite wave of conservatism. It's not an accident that it was founded in Milan. And so even with Salvini's real focus on turning it into a nationwide party using immigration, there are still a lot of businessmen in the North backing this party, and including the government of Veneto, the Venice region, which has been very successful in fighting the coronavirus, has really a lot of prestige in Italy now, and has kept its distance from Salvini, and some of Salvini's advisors and strategists, who are actually turning out to be closer to Draghi than they are to the anti-immigrant part of the League. So you have a conservative party that's under a sort of like some similar pressures to the American Republicans or the British Tories.
But how do you explain this apparent paradox between the fact you've got growing anti-EU sentiment and seemingly even very populist parties becoming much more moderate on the EU? Maybe Alessandra first.
Well, there's been a compromise on both sides, I think. The EU and EU institutions in general, I think to some extent have realized that their policies are not sustainable in the long term if they want to survive. And this is true both in terms of economics. With the Eurozone crisis, they realized that this wealth gap, or this monetary union without any kind of fiscal union, is not going to work in the long term. You have these huge losses for Southern European countries, especially Italy. Its economy was doing better before joining the euro, and then you have these huge gains for countries like Germany. So they realized that they need to deepen the union, which means not making many Northern European countries happy, because they have to, give up a larger portion of their tax money to support this unionization. But also I think they also realized that in terms of immigration, that if they continue on this route, it's not going to serve their interests well. And likewise, on the other hand, you have populist parties like in Italy as the Five Star Movement or the League that have realized that their position on the euro is a very risky one. They're not willing to take that responsibility of a possible exit from the Eurozone. Remember, we had Brexit, but that wasn't an exit from the Eurozone. They were never part of the common currency, which makes things much more complicated and difficult.
Sorry.
Yes, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask what Chris thought of Alessandra's comments about this kind of paradox.
I think that the euro is an important part of it. I do think that I am not as sure as you are that these parties are softening towards EU. I mean, if we look at the political crisis of 2019 that led to the formation of the second Conte government, I mean, it didn't happen because the right-wing populists were getting less popular. It happened because the first you could call it the Conte government, but it was actually the Di Maio Salvini government. It was actually a sort of like a sort of twin government between the Five Star and the League. That government was probably as popular as any that Italy has had since the Second World War. It fell not because it was doing badly, but because it was doing so well. And Salvini was doing so well as the perceived head of it, that the polls were showing that he could, were elections called, take an absolute majority in both chambers for the League, which would be an extraordinary amount of power for any politician in Italy. And what happened is that Salvini underestimated the political astuteness of his partisan adversaries, who were able to put together this impossible looking coalition, which was the Democratic Party and the Five Star, which was a party that was explicitly founded to undermine the Democratic Party. So Salvini was not repudiated in the public. He was maneuvered out of his position of advantage. And there's really no reason to believe that the public has changed its mind. So that is Giorgia Meloni's estimation, that the payoff in the end will come to the person who has really kept the faith, against immigration and against Europe. And Salvini's bet is there's really no way to get elections, at least before the next presidential election, which is in another year or so. And so you might as well wait, keep your position of power, maybe get a seat or two in the government and continue that way. At least that's what it looks like Salvini is doing.
Well, this is fascinating. And just by the way, a little housekeeping note in brackets is we're bumping against the 40-minute mark. So if Alessandra, you can feel free to interrupt. I did want to ask one final question that I hope is going to look at immigration and what it tells us about kind of Italy at large, but if we do, spend too much time on this, just feel free to jump in and say, this is my time. This is all the time I have. I think what both of you said was so interesting, and I wonder, we kind of began with Francois's question, trying to explain the anti-EU sentiment that we've seen in Italy recently through the prism of immigration. And I wonder if we couldn't kind of flip the issue on its head and try to understand what explains anti-immigration sentiment. And there's not like a deeper malaise that underlies that the Italians have turned against immigration. Although, as Chris said, it is a more recent phenomenon than in other European countries like France, for instance. And like Alessandra said, there is no post-colonial guilt in Italy. But I wonder, and this really gets at the arguments in Chris's book from 2009, but also to some of what you reported about when you visited Castel Volturno, right? And your first things essay is, it seems like there's a deeper argument, or at least one that Salvini makes oftentimes, about, cultural self-confidence or cultural sovereignty, the ability of Italians to keep and maintain their cultural identity, right, in the face of globalism and even other immigration, obviously, but just a range of threats on Italian identity. You could throw in that everything he does to kind of keep Italian products in the market and have them compete on fair terms with other countries. Spurring more agriculture in the south and protecting industry in the north. So there seems like there's a deeper civilizational almost malaise in Italian society. Chris has written extensively about it, and I wonder what are your thoughts on this, and if that could become the ground on which Fratelli and Lega unite, because as Alessandra said, Fratelli is, of all the parties, certainly on the right, the most Draghi skeptical, but there has been some speculation as to whether Meloni and Salvini can leave their differences behind and form a government. What's your sense of this, like the larger Italian malaise on the right?
I really don't think that that's a problem for those two parties. I think that when it appeared that Salvini had a chance of forming his own government, I think it was assumed that any shortfall would be met by Meloni, that they would be very comfortable working in coalition together. I do recognize that they are different. But you're right. I mean, this sort of civilizational idea of Italy is precisely the thing on which they're closest.
I would say, just to answer Christopher's points on the right-wing coalition, or rather the League specifically, not losing popular support, that is absolutely correct. I was more making the argument that these parties are not Eurosceptic like they used to be. They have abandoned their Eurosceptic positions, at least in terms of abandoning the euro as a currency. So it's, in this sense, a more economic issue. And on the other hand, you have the EU acknowledging many of the concerns that the wave of populism kind of brought to the forefront. So immigration is one of them, but also the fact that the current situation in the Eurozone, in terms of the inequalities that exist between member states economically, is not sustainable in the long term. As for the civilizational issue, I read, Christopher, your latest piece on, especially the part I found very interesting on the falling birth rates. Italy has the lowest birth rates in Western Europe. And that's not really because of some cultural forces like feminism, or, some right-wingers, especially on the extreme right, make this argument, which is absurd. It's because Italy is not it's more socially conservative in that sense. It has much to do with its economic condition that doesn't allow, individuals, couples, families to have children. And I see this in my generation. This is anecdotal experience, but obviously it's part of a wider trend as well. If you look at the statistics, most of my friends are not thinking about having a family, but it's not because they don't want to, it's because they don't have the means. The average salary is 1,500 euros a month, and that's a good salary. And that's just not, if you think about how, for example, the boomer generation grew up, by the time they were 30, 35, they could afford to buy a home, afford to, buy a car, had a very good paying job that they could invest in their children's future. That is no longer the case. People can barely pay for rent. Many young Italians still live with their parents when they're 30, 35, and they can't afford to pay their own rents, let alone have a family. It's a cost to have children nowadays in a post-industrial society. It's no longer a benefit like it used to be. Or, people make the case, oh, but poor countries have so many children. Look at Africa. Well, that's because it's not a post-industrial society. And having children there is actually a net benefit. So I think, part of the malice is the fact, beyond the civilizational issue, if we look at birth rate specifically, it has to do with economics, mostly. And it's a theme that I don't think is discussed enough. As for, what was your other question? Sorry, on immigration and the clash, you said?
Yeah. If you see from your experience, Alessandra, and reporting on the Italian right as well, whether you do bring it down to sort of the nuts and bolts of economics and why Italians have lost confidence and the ability of their society to kind of give folks a brighter future and whatnot. But what's the civilizational aspect of this? Is there like a sort of a nostalgia for an Italy of where you wouldn't hear anything other than Italian on the streets, or where you had a sort of a sense of cultural pride? Is that part of the Lega and Fratelli message as well?
Yes, absolutely. They stress the cultural identity of not just Italy, but Europe, and the West in general. They use Christianity as a means to affirm that sense of identity. which has a lot of backlash from the church. So there's a conflict there. But yes, these right-wing parties definitely use, the affirmation of the existing culture and the defense of that culture as a way to counter these this push for new immigrants to come in, and to, this idea that we need immigrants because otherwise who's going to pay for people's pensions? And these kinds of arguments, I think, make more sense. People often ask me, why is it that in the United States it's a country of immigrants and it works very well, or relatively speaking, it does. And in Europe, there's this pushback. Well, Europe is much older, so people have a stronger sense of their roots and their identity. But also, Europe has a different economic system where it's not really free market oriented like the United States. So if an immigrant comes in America, it's very easy for him or her to assimilate into the country because, it's easy for him to find a job, or her to find a job. That's my bias there. Apologies. In Europe, that's not really the case. Well, I use masculine because most of the immigrants coming in Europe are men. But it's very hard for immigrants to assimilate. And I visited some migrant camps myself, and they were telling me, we can't find a job. We would want to work. We just don't know where to start. It's a much more ossified system, like bureaucracies, and it's really hard to get into. There aren't any jobs available either. There's very high unemployment, and there are not many jobs available for Europeans or Italians themselves, let alone foreigners who don't know how the system works, probably don't know the language, and it's not as easy for them to assimilate because it's a welfare state economy. It's not a free market economy.
Chris, any finishing thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I would be careful about seeing a drift back to a pro-European point of view in Italy right now. I think that what is gone is the philosophical defense of Europe. The pro-Europeanism you see now is not a defense of the idea of Europe. It's a defense of the idea of taking the 200 billion euros that have been budgeted as part of the post-COVID recovery fund by Europe and spending them wisely on infrastructure, and trusting Draghi to do that more than the horse traders who appear to be in charge in Italy now. I think in the absence of the recovery fund and the money that it provides for infrastructure potentially, I don't think there would be much enthusiasm for Europe outside of the political class.
Well, this is a really great way to leave it at that, and we're so grateful to both Alessandra and Chris for availing themselves so early in the morning. It's been a fascinating discussion. Hopefully, seeing you at another episode of Uncommon Decency, and stay tuned with all of Chris's work and Alessandra's work. Chris, again, is a senior editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and Alessandra is a Joe Rago Memorial Fellow of the Wall Street Journal's opinion page. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
So, Jorge, Chris and Alessandra are out. What did you make of this whole conversation about Italy, given the current context right now?
Yeah, this is perhaps one of the more worthwhile episodes I think that we've done. We had planned this one episode way before the whole, the whole sort of the domino pieces started, falling one after the other, leading up to Giuseppe Conte's resignation. So this was an idea brewing in the back of our minds for a while, and it's just been made very timely. And we're releasing this episode just a couple of days, I believe, after former president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, has succeeded in forming a new government that is going to that is going to replace the one that fell apart after Matteo Renzi pulled out of the coalition, buttressing the Conte II government, as we go over at length in the episode. So I think it's a very timely episode. I think it was a good opportunity to delve deeper into kind of the big picture, right, of where what are some of the things that we can interpret about Italy based on some of the political shocks that we've seen happen in just the past 5 to 10 years, not just in terms of the populism of both right and left, the Salvini phenomenon, and also the Cinque Stelle phenomenon, and more recently on the right, the Giorgia Meloni phenomenon, but more generally, just where we're at in terms of Italy as a Western European country that is undergoing a number of political shifts that are really new, I think, across all of Western Europe. So I'm really glad we did this episode, and it's going to be released at a very timely moment. And I think a lot remains to be seen. I think people have diverging expectations of Mario Draghi and what he's going to be able to accomplish as Italian PM. I think he's notably being met in Brussels with a hero's welcome. I mean, let's just remind folks that the bureaucracy sees in Mario Draghi a true savior. There would likely be no European Union to speak of anymore had Mario Draghi not saved it back in 2012 with his famous, whatever it takes speech. Although, he was obviously a central bank governor, a different kind of set of attributions than the Commission and the Council, but the Eurozone in a way underpins a lot of the prosperity that is made that is defined Europe's kind of post-war experiment. So I think he's being met with hero's welcome. People expect that he's going to be, first of all, steer the Italian boat to quiet waters, and that he's also going to be able to deliver some interesting things at the EU level. What did you think of this sort of broad conversation with Alessandra and Chris?
Well, I thought it was interesting that they both made the contrast between what is happening on in Italy right now and what's happening in the US, saying, yes, there is a crisis, but at the same time, the Italians aren't at each other's throats in the same way that Americans are. The very fact you're capable of having, how many parties? You have Cinque Stelle, the Democratic Party, centre-left, the far-right with Salvini, Forza Italia, Berlusconi, centre-right, all of them seemingly coalescing around the same government is just unimaginable in the United States. So it says we have a kind of very different relationship to politics in Italy than America and other countries. That said, I'm not. So I understand the kind of attractiveness of a national unity government, a crisis moment. I think what unifies a lot of these different parties together is they know that with Conte at the helm of a government, it's a good moment to have this kind of pro-European figure when Brussels is going to be sending money to Italy through loans and grants. But I'm not sure a government which has kind of seemingly such a wide support is actually this strong, because you're going to have very different expectations coming from very different actors. And the next general election is in June 2023. And I'm not sure Draghi, who right now is, Draghi is kind of the ideal man of what is projecting, what they want to project on him. But I'm not sure he's going to be able to kind of handle this for the next 2 years or so, because, especially given how fractious and chaotic Italian politics can be at times. So wait and see. I'm also just checking right now that, a lot of people seem to be very happy about this, about Draghi being, especially markets seem to be very happy about Draghi taking office, and so the bonds have been dropping, and people seem to have a lot of confidence in this government. But
that's Francois. That is the Draghi magic. That's just what comes with being Mario Draghi, Super Mario.
Exactly. But part of me is, I understand the attractiveness again of having kind of beyond politics, this figure that kind of goes beyond partisan politics. But at the same time, I'm not Italian, so maybe not be the best person to talk about it, but it seems to me very strange that you would let technocrats take power. I think, I don't think that is a good precedent. I think it is a chaotic situation which may demand exceptional situation. But it says something about the state in which Italy is, in that it no longer trusts any of its politicians, and it ends up choosing a technocrat. Again, I'm not sure this is a viable solution. Who knows if he can stand until the next election.
I would totally concur with that. I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's almost like a phénomène du grand homme. There's kind of like with a hero's record comes hero's expectations, right? It's like people are expecting too much of Mario Draghi at a moment when he's being served this very, again, like you said, this very fractious political context, and what he's going to be handling as PM has really virtually nothing to do with the attributions of an ECB governor, right? It's a totally different job, even though kind of Draghi's his character, he's an incredibly equanimous person. In fact, Alessandra was tweeting about this a couple of days ago, and kind of his whole life story, kind of being, I think he was an orphan at age 16, went over across the pond, got his PhD in econ from MIT. He's had really quite a unique career, and really brings this sort of hero's aura around his name to his new job. But I would absolutely concur with what you said. I think it was very lucid of you to warn that technocrats can only deliver so much, particularly at the national level. And what I would add to that, because you did allude to a couple of really interesting points about generally Italian politics. I got a newswire last week, and I think this is still very much at the rumor stage. There's nothing kind of palpable that we can speak of as of yet, but Lega apparently has been mulling leaving the ID group in Brussels, where they currently sit with Marine Le Pen. And eventually, I think one of the speculations, again, this is pure speculation, is that they will eventually join a subgroup within the EPP. And which is an upsetting move. I mean, what I really liked about this episode at one point is that Alessandra really gets into the history of Lega being this sort of very northern bourgeois party. I think Chris called it at some point a product of the Thatcherite, Reaganite 1980s right. Yeah. And I think that aspect of their nature has been widely misunderstood, because obviously being within the Marine Le Pen grouping in Brussels, they're instantly being made a boogeyman of the bureaucracy. So, just by dint of being on the same grouping as Marine Le Pen. So the fact that they are now thinking of going somewhere else, I think is very ominous. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens on that front.
Yeah, it looks like a party that is desperate to get to power and is ready to make a few compromises along the way. And it's an interesting evolution. But anyways, I'm glad all of you could join us for this episode. Please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It's great to get all these reviews. Not only does it boost our numbers on Apple Podcasts and all these other platforms, it also puts a smile on our face and helps us get another great guest for you guys. Anyways, see you next week.
See you next week.